And chapter 10 in our book begins our discussion about physiological changes due to resistance training. So there's a bunch of different types of training. In this chapter, we're going to talk about pretty much lifting weights, right? Lifting against a resistance. So this is lifting weight training. What happens to your body when you lift weights? Well, if you don't lift enough weight, or if the intensity of the weight training isn't enough, nothing's going to happen. Like if I do bench presses with, my Bic pen, it's just not enough intensity. Nothing's going to happen. All right. So the adaptations to resistance training are based on or have a lot to do with the intensity of the training. All right. And then if the intensity of the training is correct or is high enough, then what's going to happen is the adaptations are going to be all so that you can resistance train more effectively. So there's going to be increase in muscle mass and an increase in enzymes that make it so that your muscles can function more effectively under increased resistance. So it's the adaptations here are going to be all to promote muscle strength, muscle integrity. All right. Now, if you're doing endurance training, then the benefits or the adaptations are going to be not so that your muscles increase strength, but in that case, it will be so that your muscles increase the ability to utilize oxygen. But right now, we're talking about resistance training. So the adaptations to resistance training are going to be those that are needed so that you can do this activity more effectively. So right now, we're going to be talking about changes at the muscular level. All right, so changes in muscular fitness. And what's going to happen with long-term resistance training is that there's going to be, actually, there's going to be muscle gains eventually, but it takes a lot of energy for the body to make muscle, right? It takes fuel, it takes resources. So before there are any muscle gains, there are going to be other mechanisms by which strength can increase. And remember, it's not just the muscles, they call it the neuromuscular system, the neuromuscular system. So what's going to happen before your muscles increase their strength and increase their amount of actin and myosin and protein, what's going to happen is the body's going to try to make it so that the neurons or the brain changes before the muscle. Well, building muscle costs the body energy and fuel and is not easy for the body to do. So prior to the body building more muscle, it's going to try to get stronger by doing anything else aside from building muscle. And those mechanisms there are designed to increase strength without having to increase the metabolic demand of that strength increase. So what's going to happen first is the brain is going to send signals to the muscles more effectively. Eventually, when the brain can't adapt anymore, but the person is still trying to lift more and more weight, then eventually the only thing left for the body to do is start to make muscle. So there are a number of different mechanisms or ways in which an individual can gain strength, and we're going to talk about those mechanisms. Now, it's not like we're in a vacuum here. We're also have to incorporate some principles of diet here in regards to increasing muscle strength, because increasing muscle mass requires some type of fuel. And if there's not enough fuel because there's not enough calories in the diet, then all of the calories are going to go to for metabolic energy, as opposed to having enough left for increasing muscle mass. All right, so we do have to discuss here a little bit about diet. And this is pretty much the overview of chapter 10. So let's get into the introduction here. So you'll note that it doesn't say muscular changes, it says neuromuscular changes, right? And the neuromuscular system is working in unison. They're both, the brain and the muscles are working together so that you can perform daily activities and you can lift weight against the pull of gravity. And increasing muscle mass, especially as individuals get older and older, is important because eventually you're going to have to perform your activities of daily living. Not eventually, we're all performing our activities of daily living, like washing, dressing, walking, going to work, going and food shopping, taking a shower, doing your bed transfers, getting up and out of a chair, right? And we might take these activities of daily living for granted now, but as we get older, certainly we would like to continue to be able to perform our activities of daily living so that we can maintain a semblance of self-respect as you get older. All right, so as we age, we want to encourage a lifestyle of resistance training so that we can continue to maintain the overall fitness and health of individuals as they get older, so they can advocate for themselves, so that they have less of a sense of disability, less disability. And the way to do that is to make it so that people can function and be able to perform as they need to in society. All right, so what we want to do is make sure not only are we advocating for resistance training for athletes, but it's critical for the overall development and fitness of our populations. And now, not only do we want to keep our aging population healthy, but in a course that's titled Exercise Physiology, we may also want to consider how we would keep our athletes and how we would adapt our training programs so that our athletes can also improve their sport performance. All right, one of the things that we also want to remember is that resting metabolic rate, RMR, is equal to 500 plus, now parentheses, 22 times your fat-free mass, FFM. So your fat-free mass is your muscle. And right now, what we're saying is that your energy in, or your energy out, the amount of energy that you spend on a regular day, all right, is equal to, or is proportional to the amount of muscle mass that you have. So if we're trying to balance this energy in and energy out equation, rather than having individuals do lots of endurance training like on a treadmill, this equation here says the amount of energy that I spend on a regular basis is correlated with the amount of muscle mass that I have. So not only am I interested in strength and muscle mass for sports training or to maintain activities of daily living as an individual gets older, but I think that this fat-free mass, or the amount of muscle that you have, is critically important in balancing this energy in and energy out equation. And eventually that is going to have some pretty interesting implications in regards to weight management. So rather than telling an individual who wants to balance their weight or wants to get control of their weight management to go on a treadmill, I actually would say, let's increase the amount of muscle mass that you have. And by increasing the amount of muscle mass, you're increasing your resting metabolic rate, and therefore you're positively impacting the amount of energy you're spending, and that can help you more appropriately balance or modify this particular equation so that you can manage weight more effectively. So this is more than just getting stronger and being able to lift more weight. I think that resistance training, to me, is the new weight management training. Rather than telling somebody to get on a treadmill to reduce weight, what I would do is I would tell them to increase muscle mass. Indirectly, what that's going to do is it's going to give them more muscle mass so that their carbohydrate, all right, can be utilized more effectively. That's going to make it so that they have less adipose fat. And that's also going to make it so that there's less pooling of carbohydrate in the bloodstream. And that would reduce our incidence or our prevalence of type 2 diabetes. All right. So I would say that more emphasis should be put on our resistance training as we continue to move forward and consider our weight management. All right, so in regards to that, let's go on to the next slide. Now, resistance training is quite effective. After 3 to 6 months of resistance training, you can see as much as 1/4 to 100% improvements in strength gains. Now, some of this increase in strength gain is because muscle mass is increasing, but some of this increase in strength gain is because individuals are learning to more effectively produce force, which means that their technique is improving. So one way to increase resistance strength is by muscle mass itself, right? By increasing muscle mass, by increasing the amount of actin and myosin. But another way to increase your strength gains is through technique. All right, so now what your body wants to do is your body wants to increase strength, get these strength gains without necessarily increasing muscle mass, because this costs the body a lot of energy, a lot of materials and resources. So your body wants to do things aside from making protein. So the first thing is going to be improving technique. And then the next thing that's going to improve is the brain. All right, so technique is going to improve. You're going to learn how to do your movements so that they're more effective. They cost less in terms of oxygen because of technique. And then there's going to be neurological changes. Now, individuals who have started with no strength or resistance experience are going to have the absolute greatest increases in strength gain. And men are also going to have a higher increase in strength gain than females, but that's just because of overall general muscle mass size. All right, so the term hypertrophy, hyper and trophy means growth. So hyper here refers to the increase or the large amount of growth. And atrophy is the opposite. Individuals will experience atrophy when they have their hand in a cast, or when they don't exercise, or when they don't have enough fuel, meaning they don't eat enough calories, and therefore their muscles don't have the calories they need to maintain their mass, or the body doesn't have the calories it needs to continue to function. So eventually what's going to happen is the body is going to atrophy because the body is using its own muscle for fuel. So muscle growth versus muscle wasting. A typical general rule is that increase in muscle size is equal to increased muscle strength, and vice versa. But it's not always as easy as that. there are sometimes, say for instance, where if Cassie is doing like the bench press and she feels like she can't lift the weight anymore, she's lifting as hard as she can't lift the weight anymore, even though her muscles are not increasing in hypertrophy. If she's lifting this weight and I say, come on, Cassie, you can do it. And I give her this motivation. Well, I can increase my strength gains there, but I haven't really manipulated her muscle size. I'm just sitting here motivating her. In that case, some of those strength gains happened because of an altered neurological something or other that I'm doing. And when I motivate Cassie, what's happening is, and they can't really understand exactly what's happening, but what's happening is something in her brain is making it so that she has increased strength ability. So that's all that's saying is some of this increase in muscle strength is not solely due to increase in muscle size. Some of it could be more neurologically driven. In any event, if you look at the absolute amount that an individual can lift, all right, this is men and women, and it seems as though men are able to lift an absolute value that is somewhat higher than what females are able to lift. But this has to do with a lot of like limb length. And you'll notice that the rate of increase is relatively similar, but for the most part, men are going to be able to lift a little bit more weight. And that's over the course of a number of different exercises. So this is a snatch exercise. This is a clean and jerk. All right, so these are both power exercises. And you notice that for men and women, the graphs are similar. So men are going to be able to increase their overall strength gains more so, and will have a higher relative and also absolute increase in strength than females. All right, so how are those strength gains increasing? All right, well, remember, it's the neural muscular system. So some of the increases in strength are going to be because of the neurons and some because of the muscle. So the chapter talks about your neural adaptations first. And the reason why the chapter begins with neural adaptations first is because your body does not want to change muscle. Changing the muscle requires fuel. It requires a release of hormones. It requires DNA mutations and increase in muscle growth. And that requires a lot of energy. So your body wants to do something aside from changing the muscle. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to try to change the way that your brain recruits motor units and stimulates its muscle fibers. So how does it do that? Well, so imagine if I had the easiest way for me to I guess, discuss this synchronicity of recruitment, all right, is imagine if I have an orchestra, and the orchestra has 100 different instruments. It has the best instruments and the best musicians from all across the land. And they all come to this opera house, and I give them all this musical piece, all right, a sonata in C, all right. I give everybody the sonata in C by Mozart, and everybody sits down in their seats, and we're about to play, and they've never practiced before. This is the very first time that this orchestra has ever been, I guess, together. There's 100 of the most gifted musicians, and they're all sitting, and I give them this sonata to play, and they sit down the very first time together and they play it. What is that musical piece going to sound like the very first time that all of these musical geniuses came together to play it? Tatiana, what do you think? Can you describe the sound of the sonata with 100 of the most gifted musicians playing for the very first time, what would you think it's going to sound like?
I think it would sound better than beginners playing it, but I don't think it would sound great because if nobody's ever practiced it, they're not familiar with it, and it's going to take some work.
Tatiana, let's say I gave everybody that sonata a month ago, and everybody has practiced it, and everybody knows how to play the sonata pretty well. Now they come in, they sit down, the maestro goes like this the first time, taps his thing, all right, and then they play it. All musicians have practiced. What do you think it's going to sound like when they play the very first time together, Tatiana?
Oh, I think it's going to sound much better. I think it's going to sound pretty good.
Agreed. Is it going to sound perfect?
No,
And why? Is it because they're not good musicians? Why doesn't it sound perfect?
because it takes more than just a month of practicing. It takes a lot of repetition and time.
Okay, let's say I gave them more than a month of practicing, and each individual person was practicing at home for, I don't know, 500 hours in 1 month. And everybody has played 500 hours of the same music. They get in, they sit down, very first time, big opera house, very first recital. They all go to play the sonata. Is it going to sound good?
Yes.
Okay, it could. It could very well sound good. All right. But it could also sound not good. And that's not because you don't have talented musicians who've practiced. It's because there's something about synchronicity. What does the word synchronous mean? Or Tatiana, what does the word synchronous mean to you?
Together as one.
Okay. What can you say about the synchronicity of the way that they'll play together if they've never played together before?
If they've never played together, then it wouldn't sound synchronous. It depends on everybody's ability to keep track of time and understand the piece.
So what happens if there's no maestro to do all of this? Now, I don't understand exactly what this guy does, but what happens if there's no maestro? What do you think about the synchronicity of the way that the orchestra would play?
It's not going to be as synchronous.
So can you, if this orchestra, 100 people, they sit down the very first time, they're not in sync, what do you think is going to happen to the overall quality of that sonata, Tatiana?
It's going to be a much lower quality.
Yeah, like when the bass drum kicks in, that's when the cymbals are supposed to happen, and that's when the violins are supposed to crescendo up and get a little bit louder. But if all of that timing is off, then the piece is going to sound muddied. It's not going to sound as it was intended by the author of the musical piece. Okay, it's going to sound pretty good probably because they're very good artists, but it's not going to be in sync. It's not going to be timed well. That's why this whole the maestro is so important, because what the maestro does is it ensures, especially with a well-practiced orchestra, it ensures synchronicity. And when you really find an orchestra that is fine-tuned and in sync with each other, then all of a sudden you have a beautiful sounding piece of music that can draw up emotion, that can do all sorts of things. Okay. Now, Tatiana, let's say I have 100 of the best artists who've practiced the sonata. They sit down and they play it for the very first time. Is it going to sound great?
It could sound good, but not perfect.
Now, if you want it to sound better, does that mean that each of the individual artists would have to go home and practice by themselves more and more and more? That could be the case, but it could also be the case that they're not going to get appreciably better unless they all play together. And then once they all start to play together, the violin knows when the brass is coming in, the brass knows how hard it should come in compared to the drums, and then you have the timpani and the oboe, and then all of a sudden, they're going to start to become synchronized with each other, or the timing between the players is going to be established, and then you have something really powerful. So Tatiana, how many times does that orchestra need to play that piece in order for it to sound well?
As many times as it takes.
So would you say, how about one time? Is one time enough?
No.
Or we would agree that probably one time isn't enough, but then along the continuum of practice, like, is 2 times enough, Tatiana? Is 5 times enough? Is 50 times enough?
It could potentially not be.
So I don't think what Tatiana is saying right now is she doesn't think that there's a definitive number. It could be 2, it could be 5, it could be 100. I have no idea. But the only way to establish synchronous recruitment is through experience and practice. And what's going to happen is the brain isn't going to come up with these strength gains. And I don't mean to keep belaboring a point, but those gains are going to emerge. They're going to emerge because you're using this neuromuscular system many, many, many times. So this well-sounding sonata is not necessarily the functionality of the conductor, nor is it the functionality of the wind instruments. It's not the functionality or the result of people practicing individually. It can only happen when things work together and are timed well. So what happens at first is my brain has no idea how to recruit. And this is, again, from a very hierarchical perspective that I'm talking. But let's just roll with that philosophy for now. The brain is completely and totally asynchronous. Like, if I went to go play a shift with Drew, it would be a complete mess. I have no idea where to be. I've never played with Drew before. Not only that, but I've only skated maybe like 10 times in my life. So my muscles are completely asynchronous. When I get on the ice for the first time, I'm like wobbly. My body has no idea what to do. But then if I go and play ice, pond hockey with Drew, well, first today we'd probably both fall through the ice. But if it was colder, it would take me, like, say, for instance, 45 minutes to get to the point where I could skate up and down the pond and pass the puck to Drew and not feel like a complete moron. But my muscles didn't get stronger over the course of that 45 minutes. What happened is, and so it couldn't be that I'm starting to skate better because of improved muscle strength. The only way that I'm starting to improve over that bout of 45 minutes of skating with Drew is that at first, I'm so out of practice that my muscles are working asynchronously. And then eventually, as I skate with Drew throughout the course of the 45 minutes, my muscle recruitment is becoming better and better. My brain is practicing the piece. It's working. Instead of 100 artists here, my body has more than 450 muscles, like 480, even more. And if you're talking about muscle fibers, it's got thousands upon thousands of muscle fibers that in the beginning, when I stepped on the ice, they're all asynchronous. They're working whenever they want. They're fatigued. They just can't fire at the right time. But slowly but surely, my muscles will start firing at the right time. They'll be synchronous, and then I'll have better strength ability or movement ability. All right, so the only way to establish this synchronous recruitment is through timing and practice. timing and practice, and through specificity of training. Remember, we talked about one of the let me just think of the right word. One of the tenets, not tenets, but it's the 5 principles. That's it. The 5 training principles. One of them was specificity of training. The other one was individuality of training. The other one was overtraining, or training beyond, or pushing yourself beyond your normal limits. One of them was specificity. Specificity, and that shit might mean specific. Specificity of training. So if I want to get better at say, for instance, doing figure 8s in ice skating, well, I want to make sure that I'm working exercises that are very specifically related or very close to those movement patterns, because the more specific the movement patterns are to the activity I'm working, the more of a synchronous recruitment of those muscle fibers and those motor units can be, and that's going to facilitate the contraction. So it's not necessarily the overall strength that we're improving. A lot of times strength gains come because of synchronous recruitment from the brain. And because your muscle protein synthesis costs a lot of energy, your body wants to try to improve your neurological system prior to starting to build more muscle, right? Instead of fixing something entirely, sometimes people will just take duct tape and put it around the problem. Eventually, when the duct tape doesn't work anymore, you're going to have to fix the problem. So when you're lifting more and more and more and more weight, the body doesn't want to fix the problem and make more muscle. It wants to put duct tape down. It wants to try to lift that weight the easiest way. So it'll try to fix the brain first. And then when the brain can't continue to adapt, or when the brain is adapted, now let's say, Tatiana, that this group of musicians is playing in the backyard of the maestro. They've practiced 500 times. It sounds really, really good. Everybody is synchronous or synchronized with each other. You're playing in front of 7 people. Everybody says it's really beautiful sounding, but they're all practiced out. It's perfect. They're not going to play any better. How do I make it sound better now? Well, now that everybody is synchronized and everybody is a good musician, if I wanted to make it sound better now, perhaps the only option that I have now is leave the backyard and go to a facility that has good acoustics and go to the opera house. But at first, before we go to the opera house, the first thing I want to do is synchronize and practice and work together. And then once everything is working together, I can't make any gains in regards to the quality of the way the music sounds. I can't make any more gains because of timing. I can't make any improvements because of, by making the artists more in sync with each other. Now I'm forced to make other changes. And the other changes are going to be, now we're going to have to spend the money to get an opera house, and to get the mics, and to get all of the recording equipment. Your body is the same way. It wants to make the changes with the resources it has first. Once it's made all the changes and the resources are maxed out, now the body is forced to make other strength gains. All right. So again, this next one here is showing that strength gains can also, not only are they going to be improved through muscle timing or appropriate muscle timing or synchronizing motor units and the neurological system, but there's also going to be potential increases in neural drive. So those action potentials are sent with a greater intensity or speed, or the frequency of the action potentials, the rate coding happens faster and therefore allows for a greater tetanus and tightness of the muscle. Or it could be that there's less Golgi tendon organ information. Remember, a Golgi tendon organ is at the end of a tendon. Is at the end of the muscle. And the Golgi tendon organ is in the muscle's tendons, as it implies. All right. So you have your tendons here, your tendons here. Sorry. And you have your muscle belly. And in the muscle itself are those muscle spindles. All right. And you also have in the tendons, you have these Golgi tendon organs, right? We'll just go like that. That's a Golgi tendon organ. And when the Golgi tendon organ is stretched, or when the tendon is stretched, the tendon thinks that it could tear. So what the tendon does, the Golgi tendon organ, is it sends information to the spinal cord and says, oh man, this tendon could tear because it's stretching very quickly. And then the spinal cord sends a signal to the muscle that tells the muscle to relax. If the tendon is changing its length very quickly, it could tear. So the tendon tells the muscle, hey man, relax as much as you can. And if the muscle relaxes, another word for saying relaxing is reducing the amount of stiffness in the muscle, reduce the K, or make it so that the stress strain curve is less steep. If you reduce the stiffness of the muscle, you make it so that the muscle will change length more readily. And if the muscle changes its length and elongates, it's going to relieve the tension on the tendon. So the Golgi tendon organ sends a signal to the spinal cord that makes the muscle stop contracting. Well, that means that it's these potentially inhibitory. Inhibit is to slow down or to stop these neurological impulses or signals from the Golgi tendon organ. And if the Golgi tendon organ is not sending the signals to the spinal cord, afraid that it's going to tear, then it's not going to make the muscle relax. And if the muscle can stay contracted for longer, then you're going to have an increase in strength gain. So it's not only the case that this muscle timing or muscle protein increase, all right, is the thing that's leading to strength gains. It could be the case that along with the timing, the synchronicity, the increase in actin and myosin, whoopsie, forgot an I, it could be the case that there are other things that are also contributing to increased strength gains. But most of them are going to be related to the neuromuscular unit. So the neurons and the muscles. And for the most part, the body wants to change the neurological component prior to building muscle. Because again, muscle requires energy to build. All right, so let's go to the next slide here. All right, and we just went over this, all right? The Golgi tendon organs are typically going to make it so that the muscle contraction is inhibited. All right, the Golgi tendon organs are going to fire. They're going to send an inhibitory or a signal. Well, they're not going to send an inhibitory signal. The Golgi tendon organs is going to send its afferent information to the spinal cord. then the spinal cord is going to send an inhibitory signal to the muscle to get the muscle to relax. And when the muscle relaxes, it relieves tension on the tendon. So these inhibitory muscle contractions are a instinctual or a reflexive action to maintain the integrity of your tendons, your neuromuscular system. And that's a good thing because it's preventing damage. And through training, you can reduce these impulses. You can reduce this impulse that is sent back to the muscle to get the muscle to relax. And if the muscle is relaxed, it can't be contracting. And if the muscle can't be contracting, it can't produce force. So if I can get that muscle to contract for a longer period of time, I can generate more force. You might have heard of like instances where people have all of a sudden had this superhuman strength, like there's a baby or a child stuck under a car, and then a person goes over to the car and they're able to lift the edge of the car and they're able to get the little baby out from underneath the car. Well, how can they do that? How does somebody lift a car? Well, you would think that if their muscles, and now I don't know, but one potential explanation is as they go to lift the car obviously has an incredible weight to it. So what the car is going to do is the car is going to stretch their tendons, their bicep tendons, as they're lifting the car. And when they stretch their bicep tendons, because the car is very heavy, typically what would happen is that increased stretch of the bicep tendon at some point would make it so that the muscle just gives up and cannot do its bout of activity. But it could be the case that adrenaline and those feelings that you feel when you need to try to save somebody kick in, and they make it so that there's a reduction in these Golgi tendon organs in terms of them sending this information. And if that's the case, their muscles don't relax spontaneously to prevent that damage. And if that's the case, they might be able to lift their they lift more weight for a longer period of time. And that's one potential way this reduction in your autogenic inhibition to the muscles that they can explain where people all of a sudden have superhuman strength. All right, but that superhuman strength is not a result of hypertrophy or muscle growth. That's another example of increased strength gain without necessarily increasing hypertrophy. Again, based on the neurological aspect of this neuromuscular system. So there are many neurological factors that can factor into the overall amount of strength. All right, now another thing that you could think is, let's say I'm doing a bicep curl. I'm just going to do a quick drawing here. Here's my humerus. This is not a great drawing. I'm just doing it very quickly. Here's my bicep curl. Here's my ulna and my radius. Or we'll just say they're one bone for now. Here's my hand. It's not a great hand. Doesn't matter. Here's my bicep here. My bicep tendon. Here's my bicep. And my bicep is going to, let's go like this. Let's erase this part here. Make this look a little bit better. Oh boy. Undo. Now the bicep is going to fire and it's going to make the hand go in this direction. Now, when the arm contracts and the arm, if the bicep is contracting and contracting, let's say we just put another and the arm gets all the way to here, and the arm is moving in this direction here, Aubrey, what's the thing that stops the arm from continuing all the way in this direction and just crushing through my shoulder? Now, another way of asking the question is, when this muscle fires, Aubrey, okay, it's like the gas pedal. And the gas pedal, when the muscle fires, is going to pull the hand in this direction. What's going to stop that? What stops that motion from happening? What's the brake pedal, Aubrey, in that particular activity?
Would it be the tendon, the bicep tendon?
Okay, it could be the bicep tendon. It could also be the ligaments of in the elbow here. But remember, let's think of your muscles act as the gas pedal, and they also act as the brake pedal, Aubrey. All right, so this bicep is the agonist. The agonist is the muscle that's creating this motion. All right, the agonist. All right, the agonist is the muscle creating the movement. Aubrey, what's an antagonist?
Isn't the antagonist the opposite muscle?
Okay, so can the opposite muscle, I don't know exactly,
Oh,
I
when-
know personally what you're talking about, but can you use a different phrase there?
So if the agonist is working to help the movement happen, the antagonist would be doing the opposite and trying to stop the motion.
Okay, so in this situation, I have my biceps muscle, right?
And then the tricep would be
There
the
we go, there we go.
agonist.
Excellent. So your biceps is the gas pedal, and your triceps is the brake pedal. Now, if the bicep just continues to fire and fire and fire, eventually what it's going to do is it's going to just take the forearm and pull it so far in this direction that I could eventually actually just injure the ligaments that hold my elbow together. Like there's something that's slowing that down. And the thing that slows it down is my tricep. So my tricep is attached to here, right? And then as the bicep fires in this direction and creates the gas pedal, eventually the triceps are going to fire in the opposite direction, and they're going to make it so that this limb slows down. They're going to fire and they're going to be the brake pedal. And now so the gas pedal is the biceps, the triceps is the brake. And remember, the gas pedal, the triceps are firing concentrically. And that means the brake pedal, the triceps are going to fire eccentrically. And they're firing eccentrically to slow down the flexion of the arm. All right. What happens if the biceps fire concentrically with the same amount that the triceps fire eccentrically? What would happen then, Aubrey?
Would there be no movement?
Absolutely correct. All right. So normally, in most situations, the tricep is either going to fire, or the antagonist is going to fire in the opposite direction as my agonist, so that it can either slow down the activity, or if it fires enough, what it's going to do is it's going to actually stop the activity. So it could be the case that this firing of the antagonist has something to do with opposing the amount of force, or reducing the total amount of force that this bicep can produce So maybe what happens is there is a reduction in the activation of CoA, both of them at the same time. So there's a reduction in the activation of the antagonist. So there's less of a reduction in strength that is provided by the agonist. All right, so it could be the case that there's a change either in the timing or the relative intensity of the antagonist muscle. And what that does is it increases the potential contribution of the agonist, resulting in more positive or agonist associated force, and therefore more overall strength. Okay, and it could also be the case that at the neuromuscular junction, this is your neuron, this is your vesicles that contain your acetylcholine, this is your neuromuscular junction here, right? And then you're going to have your receptors for acetylcholine on the muscle wall, and then you're going to have your actin and myosin and here, all these striations. And then if I look here and I blow that up, it looks like the sliding filament theory. So it could be the case that there are adaptations that occur at the neuromuscular junction level here, so that there's more acetylcholine, or that there's more potential for receptors at the muscle wall level, or there's a greater increase in electrical potential here. And if there's more electrical potential, it allows for this acetylcholine to bring the action potential all the way through the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that increases the ability to release calcium into the sarcomere. So it could be the case that this neuromuscular junction morphs, changes. The way in which the morphs, the changing of the neuromuscular junction happens could also be another neural factor. But up until here, up until slide 14, we really haven't talked at all about any of the muscular physiological changes that are occurring to resistance exercising. We're only talking about the way that the brain has adapted. So the next couple of slides talks about how the muscles will adapt. All right. Does anybody have any questions up until where we're at right now? We got about another half an hour, so we'll do a half an hour more, and then we'll get to our IRAT, GRAT for chapter 9. All right. So muscles will increase their size, hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy is the same thing as saying growth, muscle growth. In my periodization chart, my muscle hypertrophy or my growth phase is in the off season. I want my muscles to increase size. And the way for hypertrophy to occur is for a release of hormones into the muscle fiber itself that will change the RNA or the genetic structure of those muscle fibers, and eventually those changes will result in increases in the amount of actin and myosin in the muscle. All right, so ultimately these hypertrophy gains, hypertrophy is all caused by the muscle thinking that there's damage. And like if there's damage to a bridge, structural integrity to a bridge, then the city ordinances are going to make it so that they patch up the bridge. But they're not going to patch up the bridge unless there's a problem with the bridge. They look, they take measurements, there's no problem with the bridge, then we don't have to do anything. But if they notice that there's crumbling of concrete and stuff like that, then the government is, or whatever, the town people they're going to fix the bridge. So the body's the same. If your body is not breaking down, then it's not going to heal itself necessarily. But if there's micro damage to the muscle, then your body is going to try to fix that micro damage, and it's going to increase the size of the muscle to better prepare for the forces that it's going to be incurring in the future. But that's why you have to kind of not overtrain. You have to work at a higher level of intensity that you're normally used to, because you're continuously increasing the intensity, and then there's muscle damage, and then there's hypertrophy, and then you increase the intensity. And then there's this never ending trade-off between increased intensity and increased muscle size, especially if you're trying to increase muscle growth. Now, I don't want to go through hypertrophy the entire season, because I don't want my athletes to put on 15, 20, 30, 40 pounds, because then it's counterproductive to my sport performance. So I can manipulate hypertrophy by manipulating the RNA, and I manipulate the RNA by manipulating the intensity of the exercises. And if I can manipulate the intensity of the exercises, then I manipulate the release of testosterone and growth factor. And then if I can manipulate the hormonal interaction, then I can manipulate the muscular interaction, or the physiology, or the hypertrophy. So I can manipulate hypertrophy. And then there are other kinds of hypertrophy. There's transient hypertrophy. And if you all have to go to the beach or something, you might go and do like a set of push-ups or whatever right before right after you leave the car and before you walk on the sand. And that's going to give you a pump, like an acute pump. And that pump, that is called a transient hypertrophy. It happens after a particular bout of exercise, and it's has to do with plasma fluid and edema. Edema is swelling. So when I do a bout of intense enough exercise, there's going to be micro damage, and the white blood cells are going to travel to the site of micro damage, the muscular damage, and it's going to try to start to fix all of those little micro tears. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring plasma fluid to that particular site and cause swelling. So that acute muscle growth that you feel, right after exercise is due to increase in fluid retention in that area, and typically will disappear. But chronic hypertrophy, this chronic muscle growth, this long-term muscle growth, is something that I'm trying to manipulate and make happen. And then, so I follow all of the ACSM guidelines, and what happens at the end of those 12 weeks is, guess what? Muscle growth. And then the parents are like, wow, isn't this amazing? I'm so happy that the strength and conditioning program is effective. It seems to work. And I'm not surprised by it. The work that I do is based on the ACSM guidelines, and that's all based on extensive research. And they're not going to publish it unless the R value of the statistics are better than 0.85, right? So to me, this is going to work more than 85% of the time with my athletes, ensuring me success and making it so that my boss sees improvement. So I'm using just exercise physiology, the knowledge that I gained, and the way to manipulate my intensity and my hormones based on the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, so that I'm almost guaranteeing that my coaching works. In any event, what I want to do when I do my off-season strength training is to manipulate chronic hypertrophy so that I can get actual structural change. And what's going to change? Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be an increase in actin and myosin. And that's the number one thing that I'm trying to manipulate. I want to increase actin and myosin. And what's going to happen is that's going to lead to fiber hypertrophy. And the way that it does it is actin and myosin. The way that it does it is somewhat similar to like the rings of a tree. When a tree gets older, all right, the tree doesn't make more and more trunks, right? It's just got one trunk. A tree only has one trunk. But what's going to happen is that trunk is going to become wider and wider, and it's going to bigger and bigger diameter and bigger diameter. And you have these rings of a tree. And what happens is the diameter of the muscle increases, but not the number of muscle fibers. So hypertrophy is increase in the growth of the muscle. And they're saying that the growth of the muscle happens because the fiber is growing. And the fiber grows by laying more and more actin and myosin and sarcomeres, all right, kind of around each other. And each muscle fiber grows in diameter. This term right here, hyperplasia, refers to splitting of one muscle fiber into two muscle fibers. So they're saying that chronic hypertrophy or long-term muscle growth happens because of hypertrophy, which is increase in diameter of muscle fiber size, or it happens because of hyperplasia. But the research on hyperplasia is very inconclusive. They can only really see statistically significant results in cats and in mice and other animals that they've tested, and don't see a large amount of hypertrophy in human beings because of hyperplasia. Although it does occur a little tiny bit, they think. But the research is very inconclusive. So what I would say for this course is we want to really just focus on hypertrophy and how you can manipulate your workout so that you can guarantee that you have hypertrophy occurring. All right, so it would be one thing if I didn't know that my athlete's muscles were going to increase in strength, but before the season happens, I already know that if I do 12 weeks of exercise and my athletes have an appropriate diet, in those 12 weeks of exercise, they should put on a half pound a week, all right, a half pound a week, and we can manipulate that half pound a week by diet and training. And that means in 6 weeks, they should put on 6 pounds. And I would bet probably for 90% of my athletes, they put on anywhere between 5 and 7 pounds. It's astounding how similar each athlete is, but it seems to work. All right. So how do I do that? Well, number one, what I do is I make sure that I remember my rules. Eccentric training tears the Z lines, the sarcomeres apart, and it breaks the muscle down. It causes these disruptions in the Z discs and the Z lines, and it actually causes micro damage. All right, so micro damage is the thing that is going to trigger this hormonal response. Now, if there is no micro damage, then the muscles or the body or the brain, whatever, from a hierarchical perspective, the brain doesn't think that there's going to be any issue. But if you do eccentric muscle training and you tear these muscles apart, then your body is going to want to heal or make your muscles even more effective for the next bout of exercising. So it's going to do protein remodeling. Protein is actin and myosin, and remodeling is growth. Like if I remodel my house, then it starts kind of good and I like it, but after remodeling, it's even better. So these proteins, these actin and myosins, or these filaments, are going to be remodeled. And the way that they're going to be remodeled is another layer of actin and myosin is going to grow around the initial layer and make that muscle fiber a little bit thicker. And then eventually, thicker and thicker and thicker muscle fibers, all right, result in bigger muscles. So that's what this protein remodeling is doing. There's even research that suggests that typical concentric training, regular bicep curls, all right, against the direction of gravity, bicep curls in this direction here actually might limit strength gains and hypertrophy. So make sure that your clients or that you work on your negatives. All right, or your eccentric muscle contractions, or you want to manipulate this, remember, force velocity curve, where I have my concentric muscle contractions are powerful at lower velocities, and they get weaker and weaker at higher velocities, and my concentric muscle contractions are weaker and weaker at lower velocities. So what you might want to do is, that's why they say when you do a chin up, you want to go up fast and down slow. The reason why is because your muscles are not good. This is the concentric, and this is a review from a couple chapters ago, so it's not, I'm not drawing it very elaborately. But concentric muscle contractions are already pretty effective at producing a force, all right, at lower velocities. So at low velocities, concentric muscle contractions produce the highest amount of force, all right? At high velocities, concentric contractions can't produce a very high force at all. Likewise, at lower velocities, eccentric muscle contractions can't produce a lot of force. And at high velocities, they can produce a good amount of force. So if you want to promote this disruption or this breakdown of your muscles, you want to work your eccentric muscle contractions at lower velocities. All right, eccentric is going down, and you want to work it slow, whereas your concentric muscle contractions are the ones that are going up, concentric, but they're already good at doing them at low velocities, so you want to go high. So you want to go high speed concentric contractions, all right, and you want to go low speed eccentric muscle contractions. That's why your trainer will say go up fast and down slow. Up fast and down slow, especially if they're trying to promote muscle hypertrophy. All right, and then this eccentric muscle contraction, elongating the muscle, pulls these sarcomeres apart, creates this disruption in the muscle fiber that results in the body saying, oh man, there is damage. Send testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, send it to those muscle fibers. And because the steroid hormones, testosterone, and those are steroidal hormones, there's nothing to stop the hormone seeping directly through the cytoplasm into the DNA, changing the RNA, and resulting in more actin and myosin layering what's already there and increasing the hypertrophy of the muscle fiber. So with fiber hypertrophy, there are increases in the myofibrils. There's more of the actin and myosin filaments. There's increase in the plumbing or the interspersion of the sarcoplasm, so that there's more ability to store calcium. All right, and there's potentially more connective tissue in regards to the hypertrophy associated with increases in muscle fibers. Resistance training increases protein synthesis because, especially if this resistance training is at a high enough intensity. Now, if I do resistance training and all I lift is feathers and Bic pens, the resistance training isn't going to cause this muscle degradation. It's not going to cause this tearing of the muscles, so there won't be protein synthesis. All right. So when there is this degradation of muscle fiber because of this increased exercise, all right, the testosterone is going to be released. It's going to increase muscle mass. We already talked about this stuff. It's through the interaction of your endocrine system, your hormones, and your neuromuscular system, where your fiber hypertrophy is going to emerge. But this isn't the brain telling the fibers to grow. There's no brain in the fiber itself telling the fiber to grow. I've never thought of hypertrophy ever in my life. Hypertrophy seems to just kind of happen naturally, but hierarchical motor programming theory does not account for things that happen just kind of spontaneously, but dynamic systems theory does. Hypertrophy is an emergent property of the endocrine system functioning with a neuromuscular system. And what those two things do is they combine to make this even more complicated endocrine neuromuscular system. And what emerges from that is exercise physiology. So exercise physiology isn't this cognitive conscious thing that we're all controlling. It emerges. It's a complex emergent property of not only one system functioning, but now systems of themselves functioning with other systems, right? And that combined systems dynamic makes another system entirely that I don't even know what that is, right? But what's amazing is what emerges from that is muscle growth. It's all based on hormones and hormonal interactions. One second. So they have done some research on cats and animals, and they find that there is hyperplasia, but they find that almost all of the hypertrophy, almost all of the muscle growth is attributed to fiber hypertrophy as opposed to hyperplasia. All right. In fact, hyperplasia is very rare. And if we're talking about hyperplasia, it might make it more, I guess, appropriate to say that some type 2 muscle fiber types, remember type 2 is your fast twitch, and there's type 2A and type 2X muscle fiber types. Some of the type 2X and A muscle fiber types can interchange. But in regards to hyperplasia, it's very rare, and it's only under certain conditions. So for the most part, we're going to talk more about hypertrophy as opposed to hyperplasia. All right. There's another way that muscles can become larger. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with the increase in actin and myosin, but it has to do with these cells called satellite cells. When your muscle is injured, either because of an acute injury, or let's talk about these micro damages that are occurring because of the intensity and duration of resistance training. So these muscle injuries right here we'll talk about are exercise related injuries, all right? Not necessarily catastrophic injuries. What'll happen is these micro damages result in a release of these satellite cells, and these satellite cells travel to where the injury is, all right? So they travel to where these micro damages are. And then these satellite cells kind of attach like a scab to where the damage is. All right, and you could see that these satellite cells have a particular mass and size to them. So you can imagine if a bunch of these satellite cells attach and attach and attach, eventually what's going to happen is the overall diameter of this myofiber is going to increase because it's layered by these satellite cell scabs. Eventually what happens is these satellite cells layer and kind of fill in the micro damage gaps, and then they change from myofibers to these satellite cells they change to these things called myonuclei. And they kind of like just act as almost like a scab or a scar. And you could imagine if I do chronic resistance training, the myonuclei and the will increase, the numbers of them will increase along these muscle fibers. And that also could contribute to the actual hypertrophy or overall size of the muscle fiber. So that could be another way that muscles increase their size. Okay. So now we talk a little bit more about like the timing of all of this, and we've gotten to that. For the most part, short-term increases in muscle strength are due to neural activation. In fact, for the first 8 to 10 weeks, most of the increases in muscle hypertrophy are going to be due to those neural factors. So I don't know if you remember in my periodization chart, but I had 6-week time blocks all the way down the year. And my hypertrophy lasted for 2 6-week time blocks, right? And the reason why it lasted for 2 6-week time blocks is that would bring that hypertrophy phase to 12 weeks, right? So for the first 8 weeks, 6 weeks, the kids are like, I don't notice anything. Well, you're not going to notice anything because you're not building muscle then. You're changing neural activation, getting things synchronized. Once everything is synchronized and the brain is functioning as perfect as it can be, which is going to last for about 8 to 10 weeks, then the body is forced to increase muscle size. So that those 2 6-week time blocks rather, that's not random. You know, that's based on research. So I have 2 6-week time blocks. We're going to get past our neurological factors, and then we're going to start getting long-term increases in muscle strength. All right, so we're going to get major hypertrophy after about 12 weeks. So I'm hoping that my athletes get hypertrophy at like, I don't know, they're super, super trained athletes. So they're not starting, you know, with no baseline. So I'm thinking that they're going to get hypertrophy gains in like 8 weeks, 7 weeks. So that means they have hypertrophy happening for 5 weeks out of the 12 weeks. All right, so after about maybe halfway through week 8, week 7, week 8, then all of a sudden the kids start, you know, they like look in the mirror and they start making muscles and they notice stuff. All right, likewise, a reduction of motion, like if you put your arm in a cast, you'll detrain, or your muscles will atrophy, or the strength of your muscles will reduce. So you put somebody in a cast, and after 6 hours, there's actually a reduced rate of the production of actin and myosin. If the muscle is totally motionless, or the limb is motionless, the body is like, all right, this isn't being used. Why do I have to make actin and myosin? Why do I have to contribute my valuable caloric energy and resources to make actin and myosin if it's not moving? And within 6 hours, there's already the beginning of muscle loss and strength loss and protein synthesis reduction, or tissue reduction. And if that's the case, that is the definition of atrophy. And then as the weeks increase, there's a significant loss of strength per day. And again, this is not just because of the reduction in protein, but it also has to do with the reduction in the timing or the synchronicity between the neuromuscular activity. That's why if you don't exercise and you have, say, for instance, an off season, you don't want to go back in and necessarily go long toss the first 5 pitches, because it could be the case that in the off season, your strength didn't reduce because you're doing off-season strength and conditioning, but the timing between your brain and your muscles has to be thrown off because of your postseason. So preseason is important. It could be, I know how to throw, I don't need preseason, right? But your brain and your muscles, the synchronicity isn't there. So like any orchestra, before they go on to their next year's performance, what they would want to do is they would want to get in and rehearse a little bit. So what rehearsing does is it doesn't necessarily make each individual musician better in themselves. What it does is it reestablishes neuromuscular timing and makes it so that there's less loss in strength, or it makes it so that the music sounds more synchronized. All right. With detraining, type 1 is affected more than type 2. Remember, type 2 are your resistance training muscle fibers. So with detraining, your type 1 or your slow twitch muscle fiber types are going to be affected sooner than your type 2 muscle fiber types, because your body needs the type 2 muscle fiber types for later. All right. But again, these effects of immobilization are reduced with training. All right. So if there is training, then you can increase your muscle gain. So this is before they exercised at all. Then they did a 20-week of exercises, and you can see that there's an increase in 1 repetition max. But then what they did is they rested for 6 weeks. And that rest for 6 weeks obviously resulted in a reduction in 1 RM max because they were detrained. But then you'll notice that when they trained again for another 6 weeks after that, they were able to increase their 1 repetition max even higher than it was before. So this does show that training is important, and that detraining will reduce the impact of that initial bout of training, but the rest is critical. And if you do rest and give your muscles a chance to, in your tissues, a chance to repair, get back into their elastic region, then the increase in gains on top of that can be even more so. So at the end of the season, I want to make sure that my athletes have a good 3 to 5 weeks of rest. So we don't do strength and conditioning through the month of May and June, April and May, but then at the beginning of June, we start with our training again, and then hypertrophy training occurs. Now that's for squats. It's also the same for leg pressing. All right, it's also the same for different types of muscle fiber types. All right, you can see there's an increase in a 1 RM max, then there's a detraining, and then there's an increase. And you'll notice that increase, a little bit of a decrease, and an increase. Increase, decrease, increase. So rest is important. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to set up this recipe of a recipe that allows for a release of hormones at the right time and in the right amount. And you're trying to make it so that your muscles can heal and regenerate. It's this ebb and flow of rest, exercise, and nutrition and diet. All right, so that you can get strength gains, you can heal tissues, and if you heal, you can get increased strength gains. So you'll notice this happens over and over and over. All right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, of course.
So when you rest during those like 3 to 5 weeks, like you said, so you're not like losing the muscle that you gained, you're just recovering, and then once you start like you're lifting again, you kind of build back up, and then you're able to lift more.
I mean, I would say it depends on that 6 weeks of how much activity you did. I mean, if you did complete immobilization, no, I would say that there's probably going to be, and the other thing is what I probably should do is I should go through the entire breadth of this particular analysis and tell you what exercises they did during the 6 weeks of rest. What did they do? And I didn't give you that, but that's all in the book. So what I would say is go take a look at the details of this particular experiment, which is in the book for sure, right? Go take a look at the details. All I want to note is that it's not only the intensity and duration of the exercise that's going to result in strength gains, or it's not only the training regimen that you're having your individual do within these 20 weeks of exercise. All right, within these 20 weeks, whether or not you're doing my strength exercise or Tatiana's, I don't know what you're doing in the 20. All right. But it's not only these hypertrophy training guidelines that you're using that's going to result in this jump here, but it's also maybe varying your training cycles and allowing for rest to happen. Now, what they did for rest here, it could be that they didn't rest. They could be doing other exercises. I'd have to look again into that study a little bit further, but changing up the routine or resting is another part of this recipe that if you fail to do this rest or fail to consider rest, then you could be potentially missing out on even further performance gains. That's what I would say. Like this whole thing is a recipe, right? You have the intensity, this is one thing. There's the intensity of the exercise is one thing, right? And then you have the type of exercise, number two. Then you have all these exercise related, the type of exercise. Then you have things like hormone. I'm just going to go like this. The concentration of hormones in your bloodstream. That's another part of this variables. And then another thing here is, let's say even age. All right. Let's say here is rest. Number 5 is rest. And I think we could go on and on and on. And what you're doing here is you're making a recipe. All right. If you do this amount of exercise and you do this type of exercise and you can manipulate this amount of hormones and you're this age or whatever, or you get this amount of rest, what can emerge is a result. And the result is this thing that you want, your goal. It's a recipe. Like if you want to make cookies, you need to have the temperature at 450, or let's go 350. All right, you need to have the temperature of the oven at 350. You need to have 1 egg, you know, you need to have a cup of flour. You need to have a little bit of water. You need to have a little bit of butter. You need to make sure that you cook it for a particular amount of time, right? Butter. And you have to have a particular, let's say 20 minutes, all right? Don't follow all of these. You might not make great cookies, but let's say this is my cookie recipe and I put the oven on 350. I mix 1 egg with a cup of flour and the water and the butter, and then I cook it for 20 minutes. Or if I cook it for 20 minutes, then the result is going to be these awesome cookies that I want, right? These chocolate chip cookies that are really delicious. That's going to be the result. All right. But what happens if I change this recipe very much? Like what happens if instead of 350, I put it at 450, 450. More is better. 450 is better. And what happens? 1 egg? Screw it. I like 5 eggs. Usually I want to eat 5 eggs in the morning. And instead of 1 cup of water, I want 9 cups of water and 9 cups of fuel and RIP fuel. And I want protein. I want to have 122 chicken breasts and then water. I want to hyperhydrate, and then butter. Instead of good fats, I want to eat sticks of, all right. If I don't get this recipe right, what's going to happen is these things are not going to come out well. They're not going to come out at all. And maybe I change this to 19 minutes. All right, I might still get something. It'll be a little different. Or if I do, a cup and a third, all right, maybe I'll get a little bit drier cookies. But this is chemistry. This is a chemistry experiment, right? If I change a part of the chemistry, then I get a very different result. And your body is the same thing. You're doing a chemistry experiment. Hypertrophy and muscle hypertrophy is a chemistry experiment. If you get the intensity right and let those muscle fibers break down, if it's specific enough to the exercise or to the sport that you're trying to do, if you have the right amount of hormones in concentration. And that's why I'm not going to do hypertrophy training for a kid who's 10 years old and doesn't have any testosterone going through his body. What good is that going to do? Right? If he's 11, 12 years old, that's a different story. Or if I just keep beating on them and beating on them and beating on them and micro damage and micro damage and micro damage and micro damage, and don't rest and don't allow for my athletes' tissues to stay in their elastic region, then the goal is not going to occur. Hypertrophy won't occur. I'm just getting the recipe wrong. So really what I would say is muscle hypertrophy is a result of carefully constructing an exercise program that manipulates these micro damage and the hormonal interaction. So what emerges is bigger and stronger muscles, but this isn't a brain-driven decision. This is an emergent property of the endocrine system, a system of workout. This is my workout plan as a system, interacting with my endocrine system, interacting with my neuromuscular system. And what emerges is hypertrophy and bigger muscles. All right. So I think that in order to move on with today, I think I'm going to stop there in terms of